I'm going to take you to a historic set of buildings in DC. All of these buildings represent one hospital. It's St. Elizabeth's Hospital. It's a very old hospital and it's changed over its 169-year history, and its campus is still changing. St. Elizabeth is America's first federally operated mental hospital. The hospital opened in 1855 under the name of Government Hospital for the Insane. St. Elizabeth's Hospital was founded in August 1852 when the U.S. Congress earmarked money for the construction of the hospital and to provide care for the poverty-stricken residents of D.C. and members of the U.S. Army and Navy with brain illnesses. Dorothea Lynn Dix was an American nurse, and she was married to Dr. Elijah Dix. She was a strong advocate on the behalf of the mentally ill. Through a vigorous and sustained program of lobbying state legislatures and the U.S. Congress, she created the first generation of American mental asylums. In 1840 and 1841, Dix conducted a statewide investigation of care for the poverty-stricken mentally ill in Massachusetts. Dix had an interest in helping out the mentally ill that started when she was teaching classes to female prisoners in East Cambridge. She saw how these women were locked up and whose medical needs weren't being satisfied, since only private hospitals would have such provisions. It was during her time at East Cambridge Prison that she visited the basement, where she encountered 4 mentally ill individuals whose cells were dark and bare and the air was stagnant and foul, as she explained it. She also saw how these people were labeled as loony paupers and were being locked up along with violently deranged criminals and received treatment that was inhumane. Dix traveled from New Hampshire to Louisiana, documenting the condition of the poor and the mentally ill, making reports to state legislatures and working with committees to draft legislation and appropriations bills as needed. In 1846, Dix traveled to Illinois to study mental illness. She submitted a report to the 1847 legislative session, which adopted legislation to establish Illinois' first state mental hospital. In 1848, Dix visited North Carolina, where she again called for reform in the care of the mentally ill patients. Her first attempt to bring reform to North Carolina was denied. However, after a board member's wife requested, as a dying wish, that Dix's plea be reconsidered, the bill for reform was approved. In 1849, when the North Carolina State Medical Society was formed, the legislature authorized construction of an institution in the capital, Raleigh, for the care of mentally ill patients. Dix Hill Asylum, named in honor of Dorothea Dix's father, was eventually opened in 1856. 100 years later, the Dix Hill Asylum was renamed the Dorothea Dix Hospital in honor of her legacy. Dorothea Dix was called the great mental health reformer of the 19th century at the founding of St. Elizabeth's Hospital in D.C. in 1852. She gave it a mission to have the most humane care and enlightened curative treatment. She helped convince Congress of the need of a mental hospital and to provide $100,000 for the purpose of helping the members of the armed forces and residents of D.C. In 1852, she wrote the legislation that established a hospital in D.C. Dix, who was on friendly terms with U.S. President Millard Fillmore, was asked to assist the Interior Secretary in getting the hospital started. Her recommendation was for the appointment of Dr. Charles Nichols as the hospital's first superintendent. After his appointment in the fall of 1852, Dr. Nichols and Mrs. Dix began formulating a plan for the hospital's design and operation. They set out to find the perfect location, based on guidelines created by Thomas Story Kirkbride. His 1854 manual recommended specifics such as the type of land, ventilation, the number of patients, and the need to have a rural location close to a city. He also recommended that the location have good soil for farming and gardens for the patients. He described his perfect setup by saying, "This design called for long, rambling wings that provided therapeutic sunlight and air to comfortable living quarters so that the building itself promoted a curative effect," or as Kirkbride put it, a special apparatus for lunacy. These facilities were designed to be entirely self-sufficient, providing the patients with a variety of outlets for stimulating mental and physical activities. St. Elizabeth's Hospital was built on land called St. Elizabeth. Here's a map from 1804 showing the tract of land shown in the middle as that of St. Elizabeth. The land high on hills full of trees overlooking the view of the Anacostia River and the Potomac River in southeast DC. Back then, you would have been able to see a busy Navy Yard across the river and clearly have seen the White House. The land where St. Elizabeth sit was originally occupied by the Piscataway Indians. Shortly after the tribes were moved off their land, the British government deeded 600 acres of land to John Charman in the 1660s. He called the land St. Elizabeth. Here's a map showing the farm of James Berry after he purchased some of the St. Elizabeth land. Years later, the government took Berry's farm and turned it into a housing development in Anacostia. I explain that more in detail in another video. Right next to that, you can see the land of St. Elizabeth with the hospital on it. Here's another map showing the farms that were on St. Elizabeth that the government purchased. After changing hands multiple times, prominent DC landowner Thomas Blagden, for whom Blagden Alley is named after, bought 185 acres of St. Elizabeth in 1840s. Dorothea Dix persuaded Blagden and his wife to sell their farmland to the federal government so they could build a hospital. They parted with it for $25,000. That's almost $1 million in today's money. By the early 1870s, St. Elizabeth's Hospital had reached its capacity, so it was necessary for the construction of additional buildings and more land. The federal government purchased the land known as Shepherd Farm in 1869, just across the road, which is now called the East Campus of St. Elizabeth's. 2 years earlier, in 1867, Dr. Nichols requested money to purchase the property, citing that his acquisition was essential to adhering to the hospital's founding philosophy of enlightened treatment and self-sufficiency of the hospital in order to give the proper care to its patients. The newly acquired Shepherd Farm was used to graze milk cows and beef cattle, while also growing vegetables and animal feed. Now, this new East Campus, just across the road from the original campus, Shepherd farmland was cleared, drained, and fertilized. A lot of the work was accomplished by the hospital patients as part of their therapy. By 1874, 50 acres of the farm had been cleared of tree stumps and roots and then cultivated. Money had also been spent for the expansion of St. Elizabeth's agricultural program, which was providing food and occupational therapy for the patients. Here's a photo of the patients working in the hospital's laundry, made up primarily of black women. Oddly enough, no one seemed to bat an eye at the fact that Dr. Nichols owned part of the land that he was encouraging the government to buy. The majority stakeholder in Shepherd Farm was Alexander Boss Shepard. Shepard was a DC politician who helped build a lot of DC's infrastructure. As the head of the Board of Public Works in DC, he was instrumental in installing streetlights, planting trees, paving streets and public sidewalks around DC to improve city life for DC residents. But ironically, Shepard served a stormy 9 months as DC's governor of the territory, which included a second congressional investigation that turned up mismanagement, massive overspending, and cronyism that damaged his credibility. In the wake of the uproar, Congress canceled the territorial government, which had over 100 years of directly running the district. In 1973, DC's Home Rule Act was passed, which established an elected mayor and a 13-member city council. But Congress could step in and overrule a DC law if it wanted to. Alexander Shepard is still honored in DC. Shepard Park in Northwest DC is named after him. Now there's an east and a west side to St. Elizabeth, with a public road running between them. The street was paved in 1855 and was called Asylum Avenue because it ran past the hospital. Originally, this was called Piscataway Road, after the Indian tribe. The name Asylum Avenue was eventually renamed Nichols Avenue, after Dr. Nichols, who served as superintendent from 1852 to 1877. In 1971, the DC Council voted to rename the street Martin Luther King Jr. Avenue, after the civil rights leader. Dr. Nichols would oversee the design and the building of the hospital, which started in 1853 on the West Campus. The hospital was constructed in 3 phases. The West Wing was built first, followed by the East Wing, and finally the center portion of the building, which had the administrative operations as well as the superintendent's residential quarters. All 3 sections of the hospital were operating under one roof, in keeping with Kirkbride's design. The first structure on the property was a 4-story brick building, and it was called the Center Building. The hospital was under construction for almost 2 years and was nowhere near completed and barely ready for occupancy, but Dr. Nichols welcomed his first patient. Thomas Sesford stayed in the ward that would become his home for the next 6 months. For the first few nights, Sesford had the hospital and the staff all to himself. Very little was known about Sesford aside from the fact that he had suffered from dementia, and it was likely that his new surroundings were an improvement because his previous living quarters were at the city jail. There were 2 other buildings built on the campus: the West Lodge for men and the East Lodge for women were built to house and care for the black patients because the city was still segregated. But during the Civil War, the West Lodge was converted into being a general and quarantine hospital by the U.S. Navy for the sailors of the Potomac and Chesapeake fleets. An artificial limb manufacturing shop was established by 1862. Amputees from nearby hospitals were transferred to St. Elizabeth's to be fitted for prosthesis and to learn how to use their new limbs. President Abraham Lincoln regularly traveled to the hospital to visit the wounded soldiers. The unfinished East Wing of the main hospital building was used by the U.S. Army as a general hospital for sick and wounded soldiers. Several more buildings were constructed to treat the veterans after the Civil War, and by the 1890s, the institution had grown into a complex of residential and treatment buildings, as well as a central kitchen, boiler house, ice plant, bakery, dairy, firehouse, gatehouses, and barns. Further expansion happened through the 1950s. There was construction of a stock and hay barn, a hay barrack, grazing sheds, a tool and poultry house, and a windmill to pump well water. Crops ultimately included asparagus, rhubarb, cucumbers, radishes, watermelons, tomatoes, cabbages, potatoes, corn, and small fruit. Gardening became a part of patient therapy, as did the work on the hospital farm, which lasted until the 20th century. So, how did the Government Hospital for the Insane change its name? The Army Hospital in the East Wing of the main building took the name of St. Elizabeth's Army Medical Hospital in order to distinguish itself from the psychiatric hospital in the West Wing of the same building. The soldiers wounded in the line of duty who were riding home were reluctant to let their families know that they were staying in the U.S. Government Hospital for the Insane. Instead, they reported staying at St. Elizabeth's. After the Civil War and the closing of the Army's hospital from the East Wing, the St. Elizabeth's name was used unofficially until 1916, when Congress passed legislation changing the name from the Government Hospital for the Insane to St. Elizabeth's Hospital. They maintained the name without its apostrophe, which is why you'll see the name correctly spelled without an apostrophe S. In the late 1800s, the hospital temporarily housed animals that were brought back from expeditions for the Smithsonian Institute. There was no other federal facilities for such a purpose because the National Zoo hadn't been built yet. The hospital's livestock operations continued to prove useful well into the 1930s. In 1931, the henneries on the East Campus produced 600 dozen eggs, more than it had produced in any other year prior to that one. Success from the livestock, however, made the hospital some enemies in the now suburban neighborhood of Congress Heights. Although the hospital attempted to keep the cow stables, silos, piggery, and hennery as far from Nichols Avenue as possible, they never received any type of payment to move them from the East Campus. They were gradually getting to be more and more of a nuisance to the citizens of the neighborhood, especially from the disagreeable odors that came from the piggery and from their food that were made from table scraps. The woman who spearheaded a lot of the campaigning for the mentally ill, Dorothea Dix, she served as a superintendent of Army nurses during the Civil War in 1861. Although many people believed she set impossibly high standards for nurses, the Army of Nurses was extremely successful and crucial in advancing the role of nurses in the war and in the medical field. Dix was also known for treating both Confederate and Union soldiers, a practice which gained her respect from many people. This was during a period when male doctors openly expressed disdain for female nurses. Dix continued to push for formal training and more opportunity for women nurses. Over the course of the war, she appointed more than 3,000, or about 15% of Union Army nurses. She stepped down from the position in 1865. After the war, Dix raised funds for the building of a national monument to honor deceased soldiers, which stands at Fort Monroe, Virginia. She continued fighting for social reform throughout her life. She authored many books on the need for better welfare of prisoners and the mentally ill. Her work led up to the changing of many hospitals, both in the U.S. and overseas. After becoming ill in 1881, Dix returned to New Jersey, where she spent the remainder of her life in a specially designed suite set aside for her private use in the New Jersey State Hospital, which she founded in 1848. She passed away at the age of 85 on July 17th, 1887, and she's buried in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I asked Google if there was a street in DC named after Dorothea Dix, and it told me no, but that's wrong. If you've driven around the Interstate 295 around DC, you'd know that isn't true. Granted, it's a short street, but it exists. Dorothea Dix Avenue was formerly the DHS access road, and it runs along I-295 up to the Department of Homeland Security on the St. Elizabeth's campus. From this aerial photo, you can tell where the Dorothea Dix Avenue ends, which is in the middle of this photo, and also show where St. Elizabeth's Road begins. St. Elizabeth's Road exists right behind the Old Berry Farm housing project and behind the St. Elizabeth's West campus. In 2018, the Anacostia Freeway was reconfigured from Exit 2 at Malcolm X Avenue, building the new access road for DHS. Here's the history books and one of the articles that I used that I want to share with you to show where I got most of my information from. For a lot of the old pictures, I just go to the Library of Congress website. And there's plenty more information about St. Elizabeth's that I just wouldn't be able to cover in this video without making it 3 hours long. So I'll make another video covering more of the changes that are currently happening on both the East and West campuses. I want to give a big thank you to my sponsors of this video. If you'd like to sponsor a future video or my entire channel, you can click on the PayPal donation link, or you can send me a super thanks. Thank you for following me to another DC location. I am Dickie D, your DC tour guide, and I will see you around Washington.